Firstly, people know it's a predetermined outcome. He's been in power for so long. Why would you just carry on to vote for the obvious? Why would you bother to go out there and do that? He's probably worried about some of the criticism having rubbed off about Putin being a grandpa and not being invincible, not being strong. And he really needs to demonstrate, not just that he can win an election, but he has an overwhelming majority, which is unassailable and, no one can touch. And so that is why there's so much pressure on him to deliver these results.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Maxim Tucker, contributor for The Times with experience reporting from Kiev and other countries in the former Soviet Union. Maxim, thank you for joining us on Frontline today.
Thank you for having me.
Now, you've written a really interesting piece this week for The Times. I'll put a link to it in the description below. Just outline for us what it's about, because this relates to the upcoming Russian presidential election.
So in March next year, Putin is going up for re-election. If he wins that, he'll be potentially 30 years, and if he sees out his term, he'll be 30 years in power, which will put him on a par with Stalin, and with the possibility of being at the helm of Russia even longer than Catherine the Great. But he's aware that things are not going so well in Russia. Prices are rising. The effect of Western sanctions over a prolonged period is beginning to bite, and obviously there's a rising body count in Russia from the war in Ukraine. So the backdrop is quite miserable, and they've decided that they'll try and cheer things up a bit by having this big prize draw for people ahead of the elections during the election campaign, so that families will participate, will come together and do all these Putin anointed and Putin approved activities to bring the nation together again. And I guess the hope in the Kremlin is that this will produce a kind of a cheery mood as he goes through re-election and help with the turnout, because that has notoriously been a big problem for Russian elections over the past few years. People don't see the point in going to vote because the outcome is predetermined.
So this is like a Putin raffle.
It's Putin's raffles, and there's presents and prizes to be given out. So if you complete all these activities and you pass through the different leagues and get to a semi-final or the final in Moscow, you're in with a chance of winning an apartment, or you could win a holiday. Unfortunately, holidays will be only in Russia, because obviously domestic flights are the only thing they can use at the moment, or a cash prize. And there's promised to be lots of other unspecified prizes at the moment. So we'll remain to see how it pans out. It's a new initiative. The Russians are trying to pitch it really hard on Russian state media. And it's something they want to engage all the families in and have a groundswell of support for Putin, Russia, and patriotic values.
You say if Vladimir Putin is re-elected. Is it really an if? Surely it's a when.
Yeah, it's, elections in Russia are predetermined. I think what the Kremlin is concerned about here is if there is low turnout, then it's really obvious that the elections are predetermined and there is not a real democracy in Russia, not even a semblance of a democracy. And it will undermine his power base. And I think Putin is not concerned so much from being unseated by democratic means, but if it's clear that he's lost popular support, then he might lose power by coup. We saw the Wagner rebellion in June. There are oligarchs who are desperate to get out of this situation that they're in because their businesses have lost billions of dollars. So anything that undermines his popular support or visibly undermines his popular support is potentially dangerous, not through losing power in a democracy, but losing power to one of his rivals.
And does your average Russian still believe these elections are legitimate?
I think, even Russians who are very supportive of Putin understand that these are not real elections. They might go and vote because they support him and they believe in a strong man. But I think it's quite clear by this point, after we've already had 23 years of Putin in power, that the elections are a predetermined outcome. There may obviously be people in Russia who still believe that this is their chance to change things. There has been a movement towards tactical voting and getting rid of some local officials, particularly in Moscow and St. Petersburg, where there are more liberal Russians. But that's going to become even more difficult in the next set of elections because of all the patriotic fervor. It's going to be more dangerous for people that will speak out against Putin, against the regime. And it's an offense now if you criticize the government during wartime.
How would you sum up, Maxim, the internal opposition to Vladimir Putin? I suppose so much of it we're not aware of because people are terrified of speaking out. And if they are plotting, they're doing it behind the scenes. But do you think it's a growing feeling of opposition internally?
I think the growing feeling of opposition would be perhaps around the military hardliners, so not really the direction that the West would want to see Russia moving in. I mean, Putin was criticized by Prigozhin and by people like Igor Strelkov, who led the 2014 incursion into Ukraine. But Putin has stamped down on those, and Prigozhin's supporters. Obviously, Prigozhin is now dead. We don't know who killed him, but you can guess. And it seems like he's ruling the roost again, and he's asserted his authority. The liberal opposition have largely left the country if they can, apart from Navalny, of course, who's still in prison and still suffering immensely, and not able to do very much damage to Putin's reputation, being in solitary confinement for most of the time.
Sometimes in past Russian elections, we've seen sort of token opposition that's allowed to create the veneer of credibility. Are we going to see that again this time?
Well, certainly there will probably be an anointed opposition candidate that will make some theatre of Russian democracy. But it's generally understood that they're selected to be not a great threat to Putin, and there's certain red lines that they won't cross. I mean, the Navalny movement and his anti-corruption foundation are always something interesting to watch, because they might decide that they try and have protests. They might decide and reveal some more interesting information about corruption in Russia and relating to Putin specifically. But that's increasingly difficult given how oppressive the environment is there now, and also the fact that so many liberal Russians have left and fled to different countries.
So to go back to this prize draw, raffle, call it what you will, if the criticism coming Putin's way, if the internal criticism is from military hardliners, is a raffle really going to help?
It's not going to help on that level. I think the criticism of the war will probably continue, but it's going to be muted now because the leaders of that criticism, they've been punished and very, very severely, and people will be worried about expressing their criticism so vocally again. I think it's always going to be a choice for the military hardliners and people at the front lines. What is the risk to being killed by Ukraine? So what is the risk being killed back home? And what that's going to look like is a difficult thing to balance for many people. But that all contributes to this kind of mood of gloominess. I think the idea is this almost kind of forced fun, if you like, will create some kind of semblance of celebration in the country and celebration of patriotic values. And we've seen over the years that Russia is very good at staging these events. And often you can't tell that the people who are participating in them are actually desperately unhappy. They're forced. We've seen Ukrainian children who were taken from Mariupol, paraded on stage, and forced to hug Russian soldiers who were supposed to have liberated them. So the Russians are very good at putting on this theatre, and it may look convincing. It may look convincing for the people that want to be convinced. But I imagine if it is, it's going to be short-lived.
Is there any precedent for holding a prize draw like this? I mean, it sounds a bit like a tactic from the Soviet era.
Well, it's quite a capitalist tactic, really, for something novel for the Soviet era, perhaps giving out money for something like this. They have been experimenting since 2018 with rewarding people that turn out to vote with entrance to a cash draw. They were on local levels before, and this is a nationwide thing, and it's not specifically linked to the turnout. It's just designed to create an atmosphere of positivity during the election campaign. And that's something we know because the independent Russian media outlet Meduza has spoken to insiders in the Kremlin, and they've told them that that's the intention behind this otherwise seemingly quite bizarre campaign.
Just on the internal opposition, to what extent do you think, Maxim, that the death of Prigozhin will have just quietened that down and worked to Putin's favour, or has that only bought him an element of time?
Well, I think, we saw that Putin looked unsettled and rattled during that coup attempt. And we all thought, perhaps this is the beginning of the end because, he hasn't been able to put down the rebellion, and there's this very uneasy truce that resulted from it. And Prigozhin was supposed to go to Belarus. But now, Prigozhin has undoubtedly met a very sticky end. So that has, it will have suppressed people that felt that they were emboldened to speak out, criticizing the conduct of the war. Will be much more nervous about it. And we also saw images of this guy Igor Strelkov, who was an FSB agent that led the first incursion into Ukraine in 2014 in the annexation of Crimea. Pictures of him kind of beaten up and bloodied and bruised after he'd spoken out and called Putin a grandpa. So obviously, that will have a chilling effect on even those military hardliners who want to execute the war in a different way, in a kind of more brutal, even more brutal way. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of money in Russia that is being wasted, that's being squandered, that's going towards this war effort. There will be new people that come to the fore to make money out of armaments deals, but the kind of previous set of billionaires who made money from oil and gas and international trading are suffering, and it will be interesting to see how long they can continue suffering.
There have been all kinds of rumours about the health of Vladimir Putin. Do we know how credible those rumours are?
Well, it's one of those things. It's very difficult to know for sure. I mean, he disappears for periods of time. That can just be because he's got a cold, or he's feeling under the weather, and he doesn't want to just show it or talk about it because he has to present this era of being incredibly strong, almost invincible, the kind of judo chopping Putin, even though he's 70. So inevitably, he's probably got some ailments. There have been persistent reports about him being visited by cancer specialists and other doctors, and this latest rumor about him having a heart attack. But this is such a closely guarded secret. It's impossible to know really whether it's true or not. And then as soon as people start talking about his ill health, a week later he pops up again and he looks in robust health. So it's really difficult to say. It's just rumors and speculation, and probably a lot of this is what people want to be true.
Yeah, and the Kremlin's always very quick to jump on any speculation, but there are rumours, and I don't know if you put any store in them at all, that they use doubles on some occasions.
Yeah, that's another persistent rumor, and it's something that other leaders have done in the past, mainly as a security effort. I mean, it's very difficult to tell. You look at the pictures; it seems like the same guy. He may have put on some pounds one week and put on, taken off some pounds the other week, but it's really difficult to tell. And the advances in kind of surgical techniques and things like that you have nowadays, you could have a pretty convincing body double. I think you'd struggle to pull off someone appearing at public events, making statements and giving speeches and things like that. I think people would have noticed if that was the case by now.
It is fascinating, just to go back to the prize draw, that Putin feels the need to do that. Do you think that suggests that this is the weakest he has ever been going into a re-election year?
I think it certainly demonstrates that he's aware that there is more apathy towards voting than there has been before. I mean, and there's different reasons for that, because firstly, people know it's a predetermined outcome. He's been in power for so long. Why would you just carry on to vote for the office? Why would you bother to go out there and do that? He's probably worried about some of the criticism having rubbed off about Putin being a grandpa and not being invincible, not being strong. And he really needs to demonstrate not just that he can win an election, but he has an overwhelming majority, which is unassailable and, no one can touch. And so that is why there's so much pressure on him to deliver these results. That is why that he wants to have this kind of feeling of festivity, returning, the Russian values to the people of Russia, celebrating family. It's also an ideological play, because he, although he is a man who's presided over incredible corruption, and people a breakdown in society in many regards in Russia, because people have embraced a kind of culture of individualism and going off and spending money outside of the country rather than inside Russia. He's trying to sell himself as the guy who protects family values in Russia, and Russian values and Russian traditions. So that's what this is all about. It's also making, setting out his ideological stall in a way that he can't really do with regards to policies, because there are no alternative policies in Russia.
You mentioned that if he completes his next term, he would have been in charge of Russia for as long as Stalin, I believe. To what
Mhm.
extent is that longevity important to Putin? I mean, clearly there are many reasons he would want to stay in power, not least his own safety and security. But do you think that outlasting someone like Stalin is important to him, almost on a vanity level?
Yeah, safety and security is very important, but also, the vanity of him establishing a historical legacy, which is one of the reasons that he went into Ukraine. He wants to reconstitute the Soviet Empire. He wants to reconstitute the Russian Empire. So, being this kind of historical figure, being remembered in history, is important for him. But he also hasn't completed that mission, so he hasn't reunified the Soviet Empire, and Ukraine is such an important part of that for him. And he's not likely to do it anytime soon. So in some sense, if he wants to find himself a historical legacy, he needs to buy more time for himself.
And under the Constitution, and of course he changed the Constitution so that he could run again, he could run for re-election again in 2030. I know that's a long way off. Who knows what could happen between now and then, but he could be in power until 2036.
He could be in power until 2036, which would be 36 years in power, longer even than Catherine the Great, right up there with some of the kind of biggest emperors of Russia, going back through the centuries. He would, for longevity at least, he will have established a legacy.
Just finally, Maxim, and I appreciate that sort of prophesying what's going to happen is a bit of a fool's game, but were Putin to win re-election next year, how would you rate his chances of still being president by 2030?
Difficult one to say. I mean, a lot depends on the prosecution of the war in Ukraine, how long it goes on for. Whether whether the West continues its support, whether the West is able to ramp up their supply of ammunition to Ukraine, which it's running desperately short of, especially in terms of missiles that are needed for Ukrainian air defenses. If Ukraine can continue resisting Russia, and Russia continues losing as many people as it has been to date in Ukraine, and its economy is suffering, I think it's going to be very challenging for Putin to come back, in 6 years' time and win an election in the way that he wants to. But if we all forget about Ukraine, Israel has already come along and become the new focus, the new crisis. If the West tires, if the US changes government, takes a veer towards cutting off aid to Ukraine, then he may be able to realize his objectives there and sell himself as the man who reunited the Russian Empire. So a lot depends on what's happening in Ukraine right now.
Maxim, always appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us on Frontline today.
Thank you for having me. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching this episode of Frontline for Times Radio. For more on the war in Ukraine, subscribe to the Times Radio YouTube channel. Listen to Times Radio on your digital radio, or you can read the Times online with your digital subscription or in print. Thank you and goodbye.